Okay, so I know you're thinking another deep dive on horror movies, but hear me out on this one. We've got all these legacy sequels coming out. Scream 7, the new I Know What You Did Last Summer, even a Scary Movie reboot.
It's like a horror fan's dream come true.
Totally. But there's always that little voice in the back of my head, that voice that remembers all the times legacy sequels didn't quite hit the mark.
I hear you. You're excited about the potential, but also wary of falling into the nostalgia trap.
Exactly. Like we've all been there, right?
Yeah.
You get hyped for a sequel, especially one that brings back beloved characters or revisits a classic story.
It ends up being more of a hollow shell of the original, relying on cheap thrills and callbacks instead of genuine storytelling.
Ugh, the worst. And that's what we're diving into today. How can these upcoming sequels avoid those pitfalls? How can they deliver, both on the nostalgia factor and on crafting a fresh, engaging story that stands on its own?
Well, for starters, let's look at the release calendar. Final Destination. Bloodlines is kicking things off in May 2025. Then we've got I Know What You Did Last Summer hitting theaters in July.
And then we've got a double dose of nostalgia in 2026 with Scream 7 in February and the Scary Movie reboot that summer.
So yeah, lots to be excited about. But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's talk about what we don't want to see. Like, remember the Halloween trilogy? They brought back Laurie Strode, which was awesome, but
Did it really feel like the same Laurie? Her characterization felt kind of all over the place to me.
yeah, it's tough because you want to stay true to the original character, but also show how they've grown and changed over time.
And it's not just about the main characters either. Sometimes those supporting characters from the original get brought back just for a quick cameo. Like, remember Lindsay Wallace in the new Halloween?
Oh, yeah. It felt like they just wanted to give a nod to the fans, but she didn't really have much of a role in the story.
It's almost disrespectful, isn't it? Like, why even bother bringing them back if you're not going to give them anything meaningful to do?
Right. And it makes you wonder, is it just inconsistent characterization that's the problem, or is there something fundamentally wrong with the way nostalgia is being used in these sequels?
Hmm. That's an interesting question. Maybe we need to break down what we mean by nostalgia in this context. Is it just about seeing familiar faces, or is it something more?
Exactly. I think there are different types of nostalgia at play here. There's character nostalgia, like you said, that excitement of seeing a beloved character return, but then there's also plot nostalgia.
Plot nostalgia, what do you mean by that?
Well, it's when sequels try to recreate the beats and twists of the original, even if it feels forced or unnatural. Like they're trying to recapture that same feeling you had when you first saw the original, but it just ends up feeling like a cheap imitation.
Oh, I get it. So it's not just about bringing back familiar faces. It's about how those characters and storylines are woven into the new narrative.
Mm,
They can't just be empty callbacks. We need to see them actually contribute to the story in a meaningful way.
couldn't agree more. It's about striking that balance between honoring the past and creating something fresh and exciting.
Right, because nobody wants to watch the same movie twice.
Exactly. And, there are ways to play with that expectation. Like, imagine a Final Destination film where the new characters are actually obsessed with the original movies.
Obsessed.
Yeah, like they're constantly referencing death scenes and trying to outsmart fate based on what they've seen before. It could be a really interesting meta commentary on the franchise itself.
Well, that's actually pretty cool. It could play with those audience expectations and maybe even poke fun at some of those horror tropes we've come to expect from these sequels.
Exactly. It's about finding those creative ways to use nostalgia to enhance the story, not just rely on it as a crutch.
I like it. So it's not just about avoiding nostalgia altogether. It's about using it in a way that feels clever and self-aware.
Definitely. And that brings us back to you, the listener. What are you hoping to see from these new films? What are your expectations for balancing nostalgia with fresh storytelling?
Yeah, I think that's a great question for our listeners to ponder. What do you want to see from these legacy sequels? How do you think they can strike that perfect balance between honoring the past and forging a new path?
It's a tough challenge for filmmakers, but when it's done right, it can be truly magical. And with so many highly anticipated sequels on the horizon, we're about to see how these filmmakers rise to the occasion.
Absolutely. So buckle up, horror fans. We're about to dive deep into the world of legacy sequels, exploring what works, what doesn't, and what we hope to see from these upcoming releases. But before we get into specific movies, I think it's important to take a step back and really examine this whole idea of nostalgia in horror.
Agreed. Nostalgia can be a powerful tool, but it can also be a double-edged sword. It can evoke feelings of comfort and familiarity, but it can also lead to creative stagnation if it's not handled carefully.
Right. Like we've all had those moments where we revisit a beloved movie from our childhood
Yeah.
only to realize it hasn't ended yet, aged as well as we
Oh,
remembered.
totally. And that's the risk with legacy sequels, right? Trying to recapture that same magic from the original, but ending up with something that feels dated or out of touch.
So the question is, how do you tap into that nostalgic feeling without sacrificing originality and innovation? How do you create a sequel that feels both familiar and new at the same time?
That's the million-dollar question. And I think it starts with understanding what made the original film so special in the first place. What were those core elements that resonated with audiences?
Was it the characters, the story,
Right.
the atmosphere, the
Yeah.
scares?
It could be any or all of those things. But once you identify those key ingredients, you can start to think about how to translate them into a new context.
Right. So it's not about simply replicating the original, but rather about capturing its essence and spirit.
Exactly. And that's where the real challenge lies. It's about finding that delicate balance between honoring the past and pushing the boundaries of the genre.
Okay, so we've talked about the potential pitfalls of nostalgia and the importance of finding that balance. Now let's get into some specific examples of how legacy sequels have handled this challenge, both successfully and not so successfully.
Sounds good to me. Where should we start?
Well, I think a good place to begin is with the Halloween franchise, because they've really gone through the ringer when it comes to legacy sequels and reboots. I mean, there have been so many different timelines and interpretations of the story over the years.
Oh, yeah, for sure. It's almost like a case study in how not to handle a legacy sequel, at least in some instances.
Right. Like some of those sequels have really missed the mark when it comes to understanding what made the original so iconic.
Agreed. But then you have the 2018 Halloween, which I think did a much better job of paying homage to the original while also creating something new.
Yeah, I thought they did a decent job of that one. But I still had some issues with how they handled Laurie Strode's character.
Really? What didn't you like about it?
Well, she just felt so different from the Laurie we met in 1978. Like, she was this traumatized, hardened survivalist, which I get, given everything she's been through, but it just didn't feel entirely consistent with her original character.
Interesting point. I can see how that could be jarring for some fans. It's like they took the trauma and amplified it to the point where she became almost a caricature of her former self.
Yeah, exactly. And it's not just Laurie either. Like, they brought back Lindsay Wallace, but she was barely in the movie. It felt like a wasted opportunity to explore her character and how she's been affected by the events of the original.
Oh, absolutely. It's like they just wanted to check off a box for the fans. Like, hey, look, we brought back Lindsay. Aren't you happy? But they didn't actually do anything meaningful with her character.
Right. And that's what's so frustrating about these legacy sequels that rely too heavily on nostalgia. They end up feeling like empty gestures instead of genuine attempts to build on the legacy of the original.
Totally agree. It's like they're trying to appeal to our nostalgia without actually understanding what it is we're nostalgic for.
Exactly. It's not just about seeing familiar faces or hearing familiar catchphrases. It's about capturing that same spirit and energy that made the original so special. It's about understanding what made those characters and that story resonate with us in the first place, and finding a way to translate that into a new context.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And that's what we're going to be exploring throughout this deep dive. We're going to look at both the good and the bad examples of legacy sequels and try to figure out what makes them work or not work.
Awesome. I'm excited to get into it. So listeners, stay tuned as we delve into the world of horror legacy sequels. We've got a lot to discuss, and we want to hear your thoughts as well.
Definitely. Hit us up on social media and let us know which legacy sequels you're most excited about and what you're hoping to see from them.
We're all in this together, horror fans. Let's make sure these new sequels live up to the legacy of the originals.
All right, so let's talk specifics. What are you hoping to see from these upcoming horror sequels? You know, the ones we just talked about. When it comes to that whole nostalgia thing, what do you think? What would really hit the mark for you?
Well, let's start with Scream 7, shall we? I mean, Sydney's back, but I really don't want to see her just.
Yeah, she can't just be there for the sake of it.
Right. After everything she's been through, I want to see how she's coping, how she's dealing with the trauma. What is her life actually like now? Like maybe she's even taking on a mentor role,
Yeah,
guiding the new generation.
I like that. A mentor, Sydney. That'd be cool. And what about the Scary Movie reboot? I mean, come on. Regina Hall and Anna Faris, they have to be in it, right?
Oh, absolutely. But not just doing the same old bits. I want to see how their humor has evolved. Are they still in the horror world, or have they moved on? What are they up to now?
Yeah, give me that character development. Show me how their past experiences have shaped them. How do they react to, like, the current state of horror?
Oh, and speaking of character evolution, what about I Know What You Did Last Summer?
Hmm,
Remember Ray and Julie? We never really found out what happened to them after, the whole fisherman ordeal.
right. Did they find peace, or are they still haunted by it?
Yeah, have they managed to move on? I'm not sure how I'd feel about them becoming the killers, though.
Ooh, that'd be a twist, turning the victims into the villains. But I get your hesitation. It would be a huge change for them, and it might not even make sense for their characters, you know?
Exactly. They could feel like, I don't know, a betrayal of their original arcs. Maybe they could be mentors, though, like warning a new group of teens about the dangers they faced.
Ooh, that's interesting. Passing the torch, sort of. Giving advice on how to survive. That way they're still connected to the story, but they don't have to become something completely different.
Yeah, I like that. It would add a whole new layer of depth and, emotional resonance, especially if the new characters don't even believe them at first. Like playing with that whole trauma and disbelief thing that's so common in horror.
Totally. And even Final Destination, I mean, they're not bringing back any of the original actors,
Yeah.
right? But they could still find a way to acknowledge those earlier films, maybe even those characters.
For sure. For anyone who's not super familiar with the series, Final Destination is all about these people who cheat death. They survive a crazy accident, but then fate comes after them, one by one.
Yeah, and the deaths are always super creative and gory. It'd be cool if they could tie bloodlines back to the other films, maybe
Yeah.
like, a little Easter egg here and there.
Totally. Just little hints for the diehard fans to pick up on. But you're right. The most important thing is finding that balance. Honoring the past, but also, blazing a new trail. And we know it can be done well. We've seen it.
You're right. Remember Kirby Reed, Scream 6? She came back, and it wasn't just a cameo.
Oh, I was so happy to see her back. And it felt like a natural progression for a character, Like they took her past trauma, her experience with Ghostface, and they incorporated it into her role as an FBI agent.
Exactly. She had a purpose, a real stake in the story, and it felt earned, Like it made sense for her to be there. It wasn't just thrown in for the nostalgia factor.
Exactly. They didn't just use her for cheap nostalgia. She had a reason to be there. Her past actually informed her actions. It felt authentic. It felt satisfying. Yeah, it really did. Her return showed that you can bring those nostalgic feels without sacrificing character development.
Mhm.
But it makes you wonder, can these new sequels pull it off too? It's like walking a tightrope, right?
Hmm.
Between those fan expectations and the new ideas.
For sure. It is tough, but that's also what makes it so exciting. I mean, it's a real challenge for filmmakers to create something that stands on its own, but also honors that legacy. And I think
Okay.
that's what this deep dive boils down to. For you, the listener, how do you think these upcoming films should navigate all that?
It's tough, right? Like, how do you satisfy those longtime fans? How do you give them those updates on those characters that they love? But you also got to introduce new characters too, right?
Yeah.
Characters who can carry those future movies.
No, exactly. And can they capture that same feeling from the originals, that blend of, scares and humor and suspense? It can't feel like a cheap imitation.
So it's like figuring out what worked in the first place.
Right.
Why did those original films click with people?
Mhm.
What were those elements that really grabbed the audience?
Right. Was it the characters? Was it the story,
Yeah.
the atmosphere, the scares, all of that? And once you know those key ingredients, you can start to think about how to bring that into a new story.
So you're not copying the original. You're trying to capture what made it special.
Exactly. And that's the tricky part. It's like finding that sweet spot, between respecting the past, but also pushing the boundaries. And that's, I think, the ultimate test for any legacy sequel.
Can it give you that same feeling you had when you first saw the original? Can it pull you back into that world, but also make it feel new at the same time?
Yeah, it's a tall order, but hey, there's potential. And with all these horror movies coming out, we're going to see how these filmmakers do. So get ready. Get ready to revisit some old favorites and face some brand new nightmares.